The most expensive mistake in a billion-dollar company was hiding in plain sight, and the only person who could see it was the woman holding a mop. Comment what you would have done in her place, and subscribe so you do not miss the next story that may change how you see ordinary people forever. At 5:17 on a cold Tuesday morning, while most of Sydney still slept under a sheet of darkness and rain, Charlotte Hayes pushed a cleaning cart through the marble lobby of Blackwood Capital. The wheels squeaked against polished floor. Lemon disinfectant lingered in the air. Above her, a glass ceiling reflected city lights like scattered stars. Every morning felt the same. Tailored suits, black luxury sedans, laptops, expensive coffees, and almost nobody noticing the woman cleaning beneath their polished shoes. Charlotte preferred it that way. Being invisible hurt less than being judged. She adjusted a loose strand of golden hair behind her ear and glanced at the small photo tucked inside her cart. A smiling little girl with bright blue eyes stared back at her. Emily, 7 years old, missing her front tooth. Wearing a school jumper 2 sizes too big because children seemed to grow faster than parents could afford. Charlotte smiled despite herself. The smile disappeared when her phone vibrated. Another reminder from the utility company. Payment overdue. She locked the screen before reading further. Some mornings began with coffee. Others began with anxiety. Today began with both. She continued toward the executive floor. Most cleaning staff avoided that level until later, but Charlotte preferred working before the directors arrived. Less noise, less interruption, less chance for people to decide, before she had spoken, what she was worth. The elevator opened with a quiet chime. Floor 48, the highest occupied level in the building. Home to Blackwood Capital's leadership team, people who moved more money before breakfast than Charlotte would earn in several lifetimes. The hallway was silent. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed Sydney Harbor in shades of blue and silver. The first light of dawn painted soft reflections across the glass. Charlotte moved methodically. Empty bins, wiped surfaces, Polish handles, mop floors. Repeat. The rhythm comforted her. Numbers had once comforted her too. She pushed the thought away before it could settle. Some memories were better left unopened. By 6:03 a.m., voices began appearing beyond the conference room doors. Low, tense, sharp. Charlotte barely noticed at first. Board meetings happened constantly, but this one sounded different. More urgent, more emotional. She continued wiping fingerprints from a glass partition near the room when a voice cut through the wall. This acquisition cannot fail. The speaker sounded controlled, but only barely. Charlotte recognized him immediately. Ethan Blackwood, founder, CEO, Billionaire. Financial magazines called him Australia's most ruthless investor. Television hosts described him as brilliant. Employees described him more carefully when cameras were absent. Silence followed. Then another voice. The numbers still don't justify the valuation. Another answered. If we pull out now, shareholders will panic. If we proceed, we risk losing hundreds of millions. Charlotte lowered her cloth slightly. Hundreds of millions. The phrase floated through the glass and disappeared into the corridor. She should have kept walking. Instead, something made her pause. Inside the room, voices overlapped. Forecasts, debt structures, growth assumptions, revenue projections. The language felt strangely familiar, like hearing a song she had not listened to in years. Charlotte stared at the polished surface in front of her. She could almost see equations arranging themselves in her mind without permission. Patterns, risks, ratios, weaknesses. Her hand stopped moving. The discussion continued. Faster now. More desperate. Then Ethan's voice again. Somebody give me a reason this deal works. Nobody answered immediately. Charlotte felt an uncomfortable knot form in her stomach. She knew that feeling. It was the feeling of seeing a problem others missed. The feeling she used to trust. The feeling she no longer allowed herself to follow. She shook her head slightly and resumed cleaning. Not your problem, Charlotte. Not anymore. Yet the numbers refused to leave. Fragments of conversation drifted through the doorway each time someone entered or exited. Enough pieces. Enough clues. Enough information for her mind to start connecting things she had no business connecting. She hated when that happened. Hated how automatic it still was. Hated how easily her brain returned to a world she had spent years trying to escape. The meeting grew louder. Someone mentioned projected cash flow. Someone else referenced debt servicing costs. Charlotte closed her eyes briefly. There it was. The missing piece. Not a valuation issue. Not a growth issue. Cash flow timing. A simple mismatch hidden beneath complicated presentations. She exhaled slowly. It seemed obvious. Too obvious. Which usually meant it was dangerous. The conference room doors suddenly swung open. A group of executives stepped out, speaking over one another. None of them noticed Charlotte standing nearby. One nearly walked into her cleaning cart. He muttered something under his breath without apologizing and continued down the corridor. Charlotte watched them disappear. Invisible again. She returned to her work. But inside the boardroom, the argument continued. And for the first time in years, Charlotte Hayes found herself listening. Not because she wanted attention or the life she had lost, but because beneath the uniform, exhaustion, unpaid bills, and responsibilities, a part of her recognized something nobody else seemed willing to see. And that part was becoming impossible to silence. Some people spend years searching for opportunity. Others spend years running away from the thing they are best at. Charlotte Hayes stood perfectly still beside her cleaning cart as another wave of voices spilled from the boardroom. The discussion inside had become less organized, more emotional. The confidence that usually surrounded Blackwood Capital's executive floor was beginning to crack. She could hear it in their tone, hear it in the longer pauses between answers, hear it in the frustration hiding beneath polished corporate language. The acquisition was not simply important. It was personal. Important deals created tension. Personal deals created mistakes. Charlotte knew the difference. She picked up a spray bottle and continued polishing the glass wall outside the conference room, pretending not to listen, pretending not to understand, pretending to be exactly who everyone believed she was. A cleaner, nothing more. The problem was that numbers did not care about job titles. They never had. Numbers revealed truth whether people wanted to see it or not. Through the partially open doorway, she caught another fragment. A senior analyst was presenting revised forecasts. His voice sounded confident. The numbers did not. Charlotte frowned slightly. Something still felt wrong. Not a calculation error. Something deeper. An assumption error. The dangerous kind. The kind that could survive multiple reviews because everyone wanted it to be true. Her cloth slowed across the glass. She hated this. Hated how easily her mind slipped back into analysis. For years since she had left that world behind. For years since financial reports, investor presentations, and valuation models had stopped being part of her daily life. Yet somehow the language still lived inside her. Waiting. Quiet. Uninvited. A sudden burst of laughter echoed from the boardroom. Not genuine laughter. Nervous laughter. The sort people used when nobody knew the answer, but everyone wanted to appear calm. Charlotte glanced toward the door. The meeting had been running for nearly 2 hours. Coffee cups were being replaced. Assistants moved in and out carrying documents. One young executive emerged looking pale and exhausted. He loosened his tie as he walked past her. His phone was pressed tightly against his ear. "No, tell them we are still reviewing the structure," he whispered. "Nothing is final." Charlotte lowered her gaze before he noticed her looking. He did not. People rarely did. Invisibility had become her default state. At first it had hurt. Now it almost felt like protection. Nobody asked questions. Nobody expected explanations. Nobody knew who she used to be. The elevator chimed at the far end of the corridor. 2 assistants stepped out carrying thick folders. One hurried into the boardroom. The other stopped beside Charlotte's cart. "Can you make sure the executive lounge is spotless before lunch?" she asked without looking up from her tablet. "Of course," Charlotte replied. The assistant nodded absently and disappeared. Not rude. Not kind. Simply unaware. Charlotte returned to work. Yet her attention drifted back toward the boardroom again and again. Another voice rose above the others. Ethan Blackwood. Calm. Controlled. Dangerous. Even through the wall, his presence carried weight. "We are running out of time," he said. "Either someone explains why this deal survives the next 18 months, or we walk away." Silence followed. Real silence this time. Charlotte felt something tighten in her chest. 18 months. There it was again. Cash flow timing. Debt servicing pressure. Revenue delays. The pieces aligned almost instantly, like puzzle pieces falling into place before she could stop them. She closed her eyes briefly. "No, not your responsibility." Her grip tightened around the cloth. She focused on the glass. Focused on the reflection staring back at her. A simple uniform. Comfortable shoes. Tired eyes. The reflection did not resemble the woman she used to be. Yet beneath the surface, she knew the truth. The woman she used to be had never completely disappeared. She had simply gone quiet. A memory surfaced without warning. A conference room years earlier. Different city. Different life. Men twice her age questioning her analysis. A prediction nobody believed until it came true 6 months later. The applause afterward. The respect. The invitations. The opportunities. Charlotte immediately pushed the memory away. Those days belonged to someone else. Someone who had not spent nights calculating whether electricity bills could wait another week. Someone who had not learned that life could change faster than any market ever could. Her phone vibrated again. This time it was a message from Emily's school. Reminder, excursion payment due Friday. Charlotte swallowed hard. Another expense. Another number. Everything always came back to numbers. She slipped the phone into her pocket. For a moment, exhaustion washed over her. Not physical exhaustion. Emotional exhaustion. The kind that accumulated quietly over years. She wondered what it would feel like to stop worrying. To wake up without calculating. To exist without constantly measuring what could be afforded and what could not. A sharp sound interrupted her thoughts. The boardroom door opened suddenly. One of the directors stepped into the corridor, looking frustrated. He paced several meters away before making a call. Charlotte continued wiping the glass. "They want certainty," he muttered into the phone. "There is no certainty. That is the problem." He listened. His expression darkened. "No, Ethan is not convinced. Neither am I." Charlotte kept working, but every word confirmed what she already suspected. The deal was weaker than they believed. Not because the target company lacked value. Because the timing assumptions ignored reality. She exhaled slowly. A cleaner should not know that. A cleaner should not care. Yet she did. Against her better judgment, she did. The director ended his call and returned inside. Moments later, another argument erupted. Voices overlapped. Someone referenced shareholder expectations. Someone else warned about liquidity pressure. Charlotte stared at the floor, then at the boardroom door, then back at the floor again. The answer seemed so obvious now that it was becoming difficult not to think about it. Difficult not to notice every flawed assumption. Difficult not to hear every warning sign hidden inside their discussion. She reached for her mop and started toward the executive lounge. Better to leave. Better to create distance. Better to remember why she had spent years burying this part of herself. But as she pushed the cart down the corridor, a single sentence drifted from the boardroom behind her. One sentence that stopped her in her tracks. "Unless someone sees something we do not, this company is about to make the biggest mistake of its history." The difference between ordinary people and extraordinary people is often a single moment when one chooses to speak and the other chooses to stay silent. Charlotte stopped walking. The cleaning cart stood motionless beside her. The corridor felt strangely quiet despite the voices continuing behind the boardroom door. She knew she should keep moving. She knew she should finish the executive lounge, complete her shift, collect her pay, and return to the life she had carefully rebuilt from the ruins of another one. Instead, she found herself staring at the polished floor while that final sentence echoed in her mind. "Unless someone sees something we do not." The words lingered because she did see something. Not everything. Not enough to claim certainty, but enough to recognize danger. Enough to know the conversation inside was circling the wrong problem. Charlotte pushed the cart forward again. One step, then another. The executive lounge was only 20 meters away. She reached the doorway and switched on the lights. Soft golden lamps illuminated leather chairs, framed harbor photographs, and a long table covered with untouched breakfast pastries. The room smelled faintly of coffee and polished timber. Normally, she enjoyed cleaning the lounge. It was peaceful. Today, her thoughts refused to settle. She wiped down the counter, rearranged cups, straightened magazines. Yet every few seconds, her attention drifted back toward the boardroom. Numbers moved through her mind, whether she wanted them to or not. Revenue growth assumptions, debt repayment schedules, seasonal cash fluctuations, market sentiment, risk exposure. Patterns appeared automatically. The same way musicians heard melodies other people missed. The same way athletes saw opportunities before anyone else reacted. Some abilities never disappeared. They simply waited. A sudden memory surfaced. Charlotte standing before a screen filled with charts years earlier. Investors watching. Executives taking notes. Someone calling her analysis brilliant. She immediately pushed the memory away. Brilliant did not pay school excursion fees. Brilliant did not erase overdue bills. Brilliant did not help when life decided to test every promise the future once made. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a photo message. Emily sitting in her classroom, holding a handmade drawing. The little girl had written a message underneath in large, uneven letters. "Love you, Mom." Charlotte felt her chest tighten. She smiled despite everything. That single photo mattered more than every financial success she had ever known. More than promotions. More than awards. More than headlines. She slipped the phone back into her pocket and returned to work. Then she heard footsteps approaching. Fast footsteps. An assistant entered the lounge carrying another stack of documents. She dropped them onto the table with an exhausted sigh. Several pages slid loose. Charlotte instinctively reached down to gather them. Her eyes caught a glimpse of the top sheet. Only a glimpse. Less than a second. But it was enough. Her stomach dropped. There it was. The assumption. Printed clearly in black and white. A forecast model built around optimistic payment cycles that depended on conditions unlikely to survive a slowing market. Charlotte looked away immediately. She had not meant to read it. Yet the damage was done. The missing piece had revealed itself. The assistant hurried away without noticing. Charlotte stood frozen beside the table. The answer was no longer a suspicion. It was a certainty. They were looking at profitability. They should have been looking at timing. Cash flow shortages could destroy healthy businesses faster than poor earnings ever could. Her pulse quickened. She hated being right, especially when being right created responsibility. Outside, voices grew louder again. Another heated exchange. A chair scraped across the floor. Someone raised their voice before quickly lowering it. Charlotte closed her eyes. "Not your problem." She repeated the words silently. "Not your problem." Yet another voice answered inside her. "What if it becomes your problem anyway?" She opened her eyes. Across the room, a large television displayed financial news. Market updates scrolled along the bottom of the screen. Investors discussing uncertainty. Analysts warning about tightening conditions. Everything reinforced the same conclusion. The boardroom was debating the wrong battle. Charlotte let out a slow breath. The hallway door opened unexpectedly. Several executives emerged for a short break. Their expressions revealed the strain of the morning. One complained about deadlines. Another rubbed his temples. None of them noticed Charlotte standing quietly beside the refreshment counter. Invisible, as always. Then Ethan Blackwood appeared. The room changed the moment he entered. Not because he raised his voice. Because everyone else immediately paid attention. He was taller than most of the men around him. His dark suit looked immaculate despite hours of meetings. Yet it was his expression that caught Charlotte's attention. Not anger. Not arrogance. Frustration. Genuine frustration. The frustration of a man who sensed something was wrong, but could not yet identify what. Ethan accepted a coffee from an assistant and glanced briefly around the lounge. For a fraction of a second his eyes landed on Charlotte. Then moved away. She expected nothing else. Why would he notice her? To him, she was simply part of the background. Another employee performing a task. Another face among hundreds. Yet as he turned toward the boardroom again, one loose document slipped from the folder beneath his arm and landed on the floor. Nobody else saw it. Charlotte did. Instinctively, she stepped forward and picked it up. Her eyes dropped to the page before she could stop herself. One sentence highlighted in yellow immediately caught her attention. Projected liquidity remains stable under expected collection periods. Charlotte stared at the words, then at the figures beneath them. Her heart skipped. The flaw was even worse than she had realized. Ethan turned back and noticed the document in her hands. Their eyes met for the first time that morning. Neither spoke. For a brief moment, the noise of the executive lounge seemed to disappear entirely, and Charlotte suddenly had the uncomfortable feeling that remaining invisible was about to become impossible. There are moments in life when a single glance changes everything, even if neither person realizes it at the time. Charlotte stood beside the refreshment table holding the fallen document while Ethan Blackwood looked directly at her. The executive lounge suddenly felt much smaller than it had a few seconds earlier. Around them, assistants moved between tables. Directors checked their phones. Coffee machines hummed quietly in the background. Yet for Charlotte, all she could focus on was the page in her hands and the uncomfortable fact that she had seen more than she was supposed to. Ethan stepped forward and extended his hand. "Thank you." His voice was calm, professional. Charlotte quickly handed the document back. "Sorry. No need to apologize." He glanced briefly at the page before sliding it back into his folder. Most people would have looked away immediately. Most people would have avoided eye contact. Charlotte didn't either. Not because she was confident, because she was distracted by what she had just seen. Ethan seemed to notice. His eyes narrowed slightly. Not with suspicion, with curiosity. You seem concerned about something. Charlotte felt her stomach tighten. No, sir. You hesitated. I was just working. Ethan studied her for another moment. He had spent years evaluating people. Investors, executives, competitors, politicians. He had learned that hesitation often revealed more than words. You read it. It was not a question. Charlotte considered denying it. Instead, she nodded once. Only by accident. One of the directors nearby laughed softly. Perhaps our cleaning staff would like to solve the acquisition for us. Several executives smiled. A few exchanged amused looks. Charlotte lowered her eyes. The familiar feeling returned immediately. The feeling of being underestimated before she had even spoken. Ethan remained expressionless. Did you understand what you were reading? Another director answered before Charlotte could. Of course she did not. More quiet laughter followed. Not cruel enough to create headlines. Just enough to remind someone where they belonged. Charlotte felt heat rise in her cheeks. For years she had learned to ignore moments like these. They happened everywhere. In supermarkets, schools, waiting rooms. People looked at uniforms before they looked at faces. Ethan glanced briefly at the men around him. The laughter stopped. His reputation alone was enough to silence a room. Then he looked back at Charlotte. Did you understand it? The question remained. Charlotte knew the safest answer. No. A simple no would end the conversation. She could return to cleaning. Return to invisibility. Return to safety. Instead, she heard herself say, some of it. Several eyebrows lifted around the room. Ethan folded his arms. Some of it. Charlotte immediately regretted speaking. Only a little. How much is a little? She hesitated. Enough to know the concern is not profitability. Silence settled over the lounge. It lasted less than 2 seconds, yet somehow felt much longer. One executive let out a short laugh. Another shook his head. Someone muttered, unbelievable. Ethan did not laugh. Go on. Charlotte blinked. Sir, you made an observation. Finish it. Every instinct told her to stop. Every survival habit she had developed over the last 4 years told her to walk away. Yet something else pushed back. Something older. Something she had spent years burying. I should not be involved. That is my decision. The room grew quieter. Several executives now watched openly. Others looked irritated by the interruption. Ethan took another sip of coffee. Tell me what you think. Charlotte stared at the polished timber floor. This was exactly the kind of situation she had avoided for years. The moment someone noticed. The moment questions began. The moment she risked revealing too much. The projections assume collections arrive on schedule, she said carefully. One director rolled his eyes. Another checked his watch. Charlotte almost stopped. Then Ethan spoke. Continue. If those payment cycles extend even slightly, liquidity pressure increases faster than the forecast predicts. The director who had laughed earlier frowned. Ethan said nothing. Charlotte continued reluctantly. The company could remain profitable on paper and still experience serious cash flow stress. The room became completely silent. For the first time, nobody smiled. Nobody laughed. One of the senior analysts straightened abruptly. Another looked toward the boardroom as though mentally reviewing the model. Ethan's expression remained unreadable. And what makes you think that? Charlotte wished he would stop asking questions. The assumptions. Which assumptions? She exhaled slowly. The timing assumptions. The analyst who had prepared part of the forecast shifted uncomfortably. Ethan noticed. So did everyone else. Interesting, Ethan said quietly. Charlotte immediately stepped back. I am sorry. I should not have said anything. No, his voice stopped her. You should not have known enough to say it. The statement landed heavily in the room. Several executives exchanged confused looks. Ethan studied Charlotte with renewed interest. Not as a cleaner. Not as background. As a puzzle. A difficult one. Charlotte recognized that look. She had seen it before in conference rooms years ago. The moment intelligent people realized someone was not who they appeared to be. She hated that look. Because it always led to questions. And questions led to the past. Ethan glanced toward the boardroom doors. Then back to Charlotte. What is your name? Charlotte Hayes. How long have you worked here, Charlotte? 8 months. And before that? Her pulse quickened. Different jobs. Ethan's eyes never left hers. I imagine they were very different jobs. The corridor outside the lounge remained quiet. Morning sunlight now streamed through the harbor-facing windows, casting golden reflections across the floor. Charlotte suddenly felt exposed standing there. Like a secret that had remained hidden for years was beginning to surface, whether she wanted it to or not. Ethan looked toward the directors waiting nearby, then toward the boardroom where the acquisition meeting remained unresolved. Finally, he made a decision. Come with me. Charlotte froze. Sir, the meeting is missing something. His gaze remained fixed on her. And I would like to find out whether that something is you. Charlotte felt every pair of eyes in the executive lounge shift toward her. For a moment, she wondered if she had misheard him. Come with me. The words sounded simple enough, yet they carried the weight of something much larger. Ethan Blackwood was not inviting her to another room. He was pulling her directly into a world she had spent years avoiding. Sir, I really do not think that is necessary, she said quietly. Ethan remained calm. I was not asking whether it was necessary. Several executives exchanged glances. One of them, a silver-haired director named Graham Mercer, stepped forward. Ethan, surely we are not about to delay a board discussion so a cleaner can offer market commentary. A few restrained smiles appeared around the room. Charlotte immediately wished the floor would swallow her whole. Ethan looked at Graham. And yet none of us have solved the problem after 2 hours. The smiles disappeared. Graham folded his arms. With respect, this is not a game. I agree. Ethan turned back toward Charlotte. Which is exactly why I would like to hear what she has to say. The atmosphere shifted. Nobody was laughing anymore. The possibility that Ethan might be serious made the situation uncomfortable for everyone. Charlotte gripped the handle of her cleaning cart. I am not qualified to be in that room. Ethan's expression revealed nothing. That is an interesting choice of words. Before she could respond, he gestured toward the boardroom doors. 5 minutes. Sir, 5 minutes. If your observations are useless, we lose 5 minutes. If they are valuable, we gain something far more important. Charlotte felt her pulse quicken. Every instinct told her to refuse. Yet refusing would create questions. Accepting would create even more. Either way, the morning was already moving beyond her control. Ethan waited patiently. He seemed like the kind of man who rarely repeated himself. Finally, Charlotte nodded once. 5 minutes. The boardroom doors opened. Conversations immediately stopped as Ethan entered. Charlotte followed several steps behind. The room was larger than most apartments she had lived in. A polished table stretched nearly 10 meters across. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Sydney Harbor. Screens displayed financial models, forecasts, charts, and acquisition summaries. More than a dozen senior executives sat around the table. Most stared openly as Charlotte entered wearing a navy cleaning uniform and practical work shoes. One analyst nearly dropped his pen. Another looked genuinely confused. Charlotte wished she could disappear. Ethan took his seat at the head of the table. We are taking a different approach. Nobody spoke. Charlotte Hayes has made several observations regarding the acquisition model. Silence followed. Then a director, near the far end of the table, laughed before quickly stopping when nobody joined him. You cannot be serious, someone muttered. Ethan ignored the comment. Charlotte. She remained standing. Sir, I think there has been a misunderstanding. Then clarify it. Every eye remained fixed on her. Charlotte had spoken in conference rooms before. Hundreds of them. Yet somehow this felt worse. Because years ago she belonged in those rooms. Now she did not. The difference mattered. I only noticed a few assumptions. Which assumptions? Ethan asked. Charlotte looked toward the nearest screen. Rows of projections filled the display. Her stomach tightened. The language felt painfully familiar, like revisiting a former life. The payment cycle assumptions, she said quietly. A senior analyst immediately responded. Those assumptions are based on historical averages. Charlotte nodded. Yes. Then what is the issue? She hesitated. Historical averages assume stable conditions. The analyst frowned. And Charlotte glanced at the chart. Conditions are not stable. The room fell silent again. She continued carefully. The forecast assumes collections remain consistent while integration costs increase. If customer payment behavior slows even slightly, the cash position deteriorates much faster than the model reflects. One executive leaned back in his chair. Another began reviewing documents. Ethan watched without interruption. Charlotte pointed toward a section of the screen. The business may remain profitable. But profitability and liquidity are not the same thing. The analyst who had challenged her opened his mouth to respond, then stopped. His eyes narrowed toward the numbers. Charlotte recognized the moment instantly. The moment someone intelligent sees a possibility they had overlooked. "Show me," Ethan said. Charlotte froze. "Sir, show me exactly where." A tablet was placed in front of her. She stared at it. For years ago, she would have reached for it without hesitation. For years ago, numbers had been her language. Today, her hands felt strangely uncertain. Ethan noticed. "Take your time." The room waited. Charlotte slowly picked up the stylus. The wait felt familiar, almost dangerous. She began tracing several assumptions on the screen, explaining payment timing, delayed collections, integration expenses, working capital pressure. At first, her voice sounded hesitant. Then the logic started connecting. One idea led naturally to another. The room disappeared. The embarrassment disappeared. Even her fear faded. Only the numbers remained. Several executives leaned forward. Someone began taking notes. The analyst who had challenged her was now studying the model with growing concern. Charlotte finished her explanation and lowered the stylus. Silence followed. Not polite silence. Not awkward silence. Thinking silence. The kind that appeared when people were recalculating everything they believed a few minutes earlier. Ethan looked around the room. Nobody spoke. Finally, the chief financial officer cleared his throat. "Run the scenario." Analysts immediately began typing. Screens updated. New projections appeared. Minutes passed. Nobody looked at Charlotte. Everyone looked at the numbers. Then one of the analysts suddenly sat upright. "The liquidity ratio drops below threshold in Q3. Another analyst checked independently. "He is right." A third analyst reviewed the results. "The exposure is larger than we thought." The room grew very quiet. Ethan Blackwood slowly turned toward Charlotte. For the first time since she entered, there was no curiosity in his expression. No amusement. No skepticism. Only something far more dangerous. Recognition. Recognition was not admiration. Not yet. Recognition was the moment a person realized the rules they had been using no longer explained what they were seeing. Ethan Blackwood sat motionless at the head of the table while analysts continued checking numbers across multiple screens. One verification became two. Two became five. Every result aligned. Charlotte's observation had exposed a weakness hidden beneath months of preparation. The room that had laughed at her less than 20 minutes earlier now treated every word she had spoken as if it carried weight. Charlotte hated the feeling. She placed the stylus on the table and took a step back. "I think that is enough," she said quietly. Nobody responded. They were too busy recalculating assumptions. The chief financial officer adjusted his glasses and stared at the updated projections. If these collection periods extend by even 6 weeks, the liquidity pressure becomes significant. Another analyst nodded. And if market conditions tighten further, the risk compounds. Graham Mercer leaned forward in his chair. The confidence he had displayed earlier was gone. Why was this not flagged before? Nobody answered immediately. Charlotte knew why. Because complex mistakes often survive precisely because they were hidden inside impressive presentations. People trusted polished models. People trusted consensus. Few people paused long enough to question the foundations underneath. Ethan finally spoke. Because everyone was looking at the destination. His eyes shifted toward Charlotte. And nobody was examining the road. Silence followed. Charlotte wished he would stop looking at her like that. Every second his attention remained fixed on her increased the chance that someone would start asking questions she did not want to answer. She glanced toward the door. "May I go back to work now?" Several executives looked surprised by the question. Ethan almost smiled. "Almost. You want to leave? That is why I am here. I thought you were here because you had something useful to contribute." Charlotte met his gaze. "I already contributed." A few executives exchanged glances. The response was not disrespectful. It was simply honest. Ethan seemed to appreciate the difference. Before he could answer, one of the senior analysts spoke. "There is something else." Everyone looked toward him. He tapped several figures on his screen. If her concern is correct, then the acquisition price itself may be creating the problem. The room immediately shifted into another discussion. Numbers appeared across multiple displays. Alternative structures. Financing options. Revised projections. Charlotte watched the process unfold. It felt strangely familiar. Once upon a time she had lived inside conversations like these. Once upon a time, people had asked for her opinion instead of questioning her presence. The memory arrived unexpectedly. A younger version of herself, standing before investors in Melbourne. Confident, ambitious, certain that the future was something she could calculate. Life had taught her otherwise. Ethan's voice interrupted her thoughts. Charlotte. She looked up. Yes, sir? If you were sitting in this chair. He tapped the head of the table. What would you do? The question caused several executives to shift uncomfortably. Charlotte immediately shook her head. I am not sitting in that chair. Pretend. That would be inappropriate. Ethan leaned back. Humor me. Charlotte looked around the room. The faces watching her now were different from before. The amusement was gone. The skepticism remained, but it had become quieter, more cautious. She considered refusing. Then she noticed the projections on the nearest screen. The answer appeared almost immediately. I would not ask whether the acquisition is attractive. Ethan remained silent. I would ask whether it is urgent. Several executives frowned. Charlotte continued. Good opportunities exist every year. Urgent opportunities are much rarer. If this company remains available 6 months from now, why accept unnecessary risk today? The room grew quiet again. Graham looked toward Ethan. The chief financial officer stopped typing. One of the external advisors slowly nodded. Ethan folded his hands. And if it is not available 6 months from now? Charlotte shrugged lightly. Then perhaps it was never the right opportunity. Nobody spoke for several seconds. The simplicity of the answer seemed to unsettle them more than any complicated analysis. Businesses often spent millions searching for sophisticated solutions while ignoring obvious questions. Ethan studied her carefully. Most people in this room want the acquisition to happen. I know. You do not. Charlotte looked toward the harbor beyond the glass windows. Sunlight now reflected across the water in bright ribbons of gold. Wanting something and needing something are different. The room fell silent once more. Ethan noticed several executives avoiding eye contact. The statement had landed exactly where it needed to. Charlotte immediately regretted saying it. Every answer pulled her deeper into the conversation. Every observation made her harder to dismiss, harder to forget. Her phone vibrated inside her pocket. She glanced down. A message from Emily's school. Nothing urgent, just another reminder about an upcoming event. Yet seeing her daughter's name grounded her instantly. This room was not her world. Emily was her world. Bills, school lunches, homework, bedtime stories. Those things mattered. Boardroom victories did not. Charlotte slipped the phone away. I really should get back to work. Ethan noticed the shift in her expression. Whatever she had seen on the screen of that phone mattered more to her than the acquisition, more than the executives, more than him. For some reason, that realization made him even more curious. Very well, he said. Relief washed through Charlotte. She turned toward the door. Then Ethan added 4 words that stopped her immediately. One last question, Charlotte. She paused, slowly turned back. Ethan's eyes remained fixed on her. Where did you learn all this? The room became completely silent. And for the first time that morning, Charlotte felt genuinely afraid. The most difficult questions are not the ones we cannot answer. They are the ones that force us to remember who we used to be. Charlotte stood motionless beside the boardroom door. Ethan's question hung in the air between them. Where did you learn all this? Around the table, executives waited. Analysts watched quietly. Nobody returned to their laptops. Nobody looked at their phones. The acquisition had stopped being the most interesting thing in the room. Charlotte Hayes had become the mystery everyone wanted explained. She lowered her eyes toward the polished timber floor. For seconds, she considered giving the simplest answer possible. University, books, experience, something vague, something harmless, something that would allow her to leave. Yet she could already tell Ethan Blackwood was not a man satisfied by vague answers. He observed people the same way investors examine markets, looking beneath the surface, searching for patterns. A long time ago, she said quietly, I worked in finance. The room remained silent. Graham Mercer blinked. One of the analysts frowned. Another looked openly confused. Ethan did not move. What kind of finance? Charlotte wished he would stop asking. Investment analysis. Several people exchanged glances. Ethan leaned back slightly. For whom? Charlotte hesitated. Every additional detail felt like opening a door she had spent years keeping locked. Different firms. Graham gave a short laugh. Different firms. He looked around the room. Do investment analysts usually end up pushing cleaning carts? The comment landed harder than he intended, not because it was cruel, because it contained an uncomfortable truth. Charlotte met his gaze. Sometimes life has different plans. Graham looked away first. Ethan noticed. So did everyone else. There was no self-pity in her answer. No bitterness. Just simple honesty. Somehow that made it more powerful. Ethan folded his hands together. You are avoiding specifics. Charlotte almost smiled. And you are very persistent. A few people around the table looked surprised. Nobody usually spoke to Ethan that way. Yet he appeared more interested than offended. That tends to happen when something does not make sense. Charlotte understood exactly what he meant. On paper, nothing about her presence made sense. Not the uniform. Not the job. Not the analysis she had just delivered. Two versions of reality were colliding, and everyone in the room could feel it. Ethan studied her carefully. How long ago did you leave finance? For years. Why? The question arrived gently, yet it struck harder than any question before it. Charlotte looked toward the harbor beyond the glass walls. Boats moved across the water far below. Sunlight danced across the waves. Sydney looked peaceful from this height. Life rarely felt that peaceful up close. Because some things became more important. Ethan followed her gaze toward the water. Family. Charlotte nodded once. Nothing more. For the first time since entering the boardroom, nobody pushed for additional details. Something in her expression discouraged further questions. The room understood there was a story there. A painful one. Yet also understood it was not theirs to demand. Ethan remained thoughtful. And now you work here. Now I work here. Do you miss it? Charlotte looked at the financial models covering the screens. Charts. Forecasts. Valuations. Spreadsheets. A world she once knew better than almost anyone. Sometimes. The honesty surprised even her. Ethan noticed. Only sometimes. Charlotte smiled faintly. Mostly when people are using the wrong assumptions. Unexpected laughter spread around the room. Genuine laughter this time. Even several analysts smiled. The tension eased slightly. Ethan found himself smiling as well. It vanished quickly, but not before a few executives noticed. Charlotte immediately regretted making the joke. Familiarity was dangerous. Familiarity led to attention. Attention led to discovery. Discovery led to the past. She glanced toward the clock on the wall. Nearly midday. Emily would finish school in a few hours. She still needed groceries. Still needed to review homework. Still needed to live her real life. If there is nothing else, I should return to work. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. Part of him wanted to continue the conversation. Another part recognized she was already uncomfortable. Pushing harder now would only make her retreat further. Very well. Relief appeared briefly in Charlotte's eyes. She turned toward the door. Then the chief financial officer suddenly spoke. Wait. Charlotte paused. The executive adjusted his glasses and looked directly at her. There is one thing I would like to know. She closed her eyes briefly. Of course there was. What? The executive gestured toward the revised projections. When you identified the cash flow issue, how long did it take? Charlotte frowned slightly. What do you mean? How long did it take you to see it? She thought for a moment. A few minutes. The room went silent again. Several analysts stared at her. One actually laughed in disbelief. A few minutes? Charlotte looked confused. Was it supposed to take longer? Nobody answered. Because everyone in the room knew the truth. Teams of highly paid professionals had spent months reviewing the acquisition. Charlotte had identified the central weakness while cleaning windows. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Ethan watched the reactions carefully. What fascinated him was not Charlotte's intelligence. He had met intelligent people his entire life. What fascinated him was how little she seemed to care about impressing anyone. Most talented people wanted recognition. Most experts wanted credit. Charlotte wanted to leave. That made her different. And different was difficult to forget. As she finally stepped toward the door, Ethan found himself looking at the name written on the employee badge attached to her uniform. Charlotte Hayes. He repeated it silently. Not because he wanted to remember the cleaning lady, but because every instinct he possessed told him that Charlotte Hayes was hiding a story far more valuable than any acquisition currently sitting on his boardroom table. Some secrets stay hidden because people are afraid they will be judged. Others stay hidden because people are afraid they will be remembered. Charlotte left the boardroom and walked quickly toward the service lift before anyone could stop her again. The executive floor felt different now. The polished corridors and harbor views were unchanged, yet nothing felt familiar anymore. For 8 months, she had moved through Blackwood Capital unnoticed, surviving on quiet mornings, long shifts, and invisible routines. That anonymity had protected her. Today it had cracked. She stepped into the lift and pressed the button for the lower levels. The doors closed. For the first time all morning, she was alone. Charlotte leaned against the wall and exhaled slowly. Her reflection stared back from the brushed steel panels. A cleaning uniform, tired eyes, golden hair pulled into a practical ponytail. On the surface, nothing had changed. Yet inside she felt the old world stirring again. The world of forecasts and investment models. The world she had promised herself she would never return to. The lift reached the 22nd floor. She pushed her card into an empty corridor and resumed working. Dust bins, glass doors, reception counters. Familiar, simple, safe tasks. Yet every few minutes her thoughts drifted back to the boardroom. Back to Ethan Blackwood's expression. Back to the question he had asked. Where did you learn all this? She knew that question was not finished. Men like Ethan rarely stopped when they sensed a missing piece. 3 floors above, Ethan remained seated at the head of the boardroom, table long after the discussion returned to the acquisition. Executives debated revised structures. Analysts recalculated forecasts. Advisors discussed alternative financing options. Yet his attention kept returning to the same thought. Charlotte Hayes. Something about the situation bothered him. Not because she had identified a flaw in the model. Intelligent observations happened every day. What bothered him was the gap between who she appeared to be and what she clearly knew. Ethan believed patterns revealed truth. Every successful investment he had ever made began with understanding patterns. And Charlotte Hayes did not fit any pattern he understood. He glanced toward his executive assistant. Mia. Yes, sir. How long has Charlotte Hayes worked here? Mia looked surprised by the question. I believe around 8 months. Personnel file. Mia hesitated. You want me to review it? Ethan nodded once. Everything available. Around the table, several executives exchanged knowing looks. Graham Mercer raised an eyebrow. You think there is more to her story? Ethan looked toward the harbor. I know there is. Meanwhile, Charlotte finished cleaning the reception area on level 22. A young employee approached carrying 2 takeaway coffees. He stopped awkwardly. Miss Hayes. Charlotte looked up. Very few people used her name. Yes. The young analyst shifted nervously. I was in the boardroom earlier. Charlotte immediately felt uncomfortable. All right. I just wanted to say thank you. She blinked. For what? You may have saved us from making a very expensive mistake. Charlotte did not know how to respond. The young man smiled. Anyway, thank you. Then he walked away. Charlotte watched him disappear around the corner. The encounter lasted less than 30 seconds. Yet it unsettled her more than she expected. Gratitude was harder to process than criticism. Criticism she understood. Gratitude suggested people were beginning to see her differently. By late afternoon, sunlight poured across Sydney in warm golden waves. Charlotte finally finished her shift. She changed out of her uniform in the staff room and headed toward the train station. Her car had broken down months ago. Repairs remained beyond her budget. The train ride home took nearly 40 minutes. Normally, she enjoyed the journey. It gave her time to transition between work and home. Today, her mind refused to settle. The moment she stepped through the front door of her small rental unit, everything changed. Mom. Emily ran across the living room and wrapped her arms around Charlotte's waist. Charlotte laughed softly and hugged her daughter. The worries of the day immediately felt smaller. How was school? Good. Emily grinned. I got picked for the science project team. That is wonderful. And Mrs. Thompson said my presentation was the best in class. Pride filled Charlotte's chest. I am not surprised. Emily took her hand and pulled her toward the kitchen table. Can you help me with maths? Charlotte smiled. Of course. For the next hour, investment models and boardroom politics disappeared completely. There were multiplication problems to solve, homework sheets to review, dinner to prepare. Real life. The life that mattered. Later that evening, after Emily had fallen asleep, Charlotte sat alone beside the small kitchen window with a cup of tea. The neighborhood outside was quiet. Streetlights glowed softly against the darkening sky. She finally allowed herself to think about what had happened. Deep down, she knew something had changed. The boardroom conversation should have ended there. But instincts developed over years rarely failed. And every instinct she possessed told her that Ethan Blackwood was not finished asking questions. The next morning arrived with the quiet certainty of a tide returning to shore. Charlotte woke before sunrise, prepared Emily's lunch, checked that her school uniform was neatly pressed, and followed the familiar rhythm that had defined her life for years. There was comfort in routine. Routine did not ask difficult questions. Routine did not dig through old memories. Routine did not arrive carrying the name Ethan Blackwood. By 7:30, Emily was laughing about a science project while eating toast at the small kitchen table. Charlotte listened, smiled, and nodded at all the right moments. Yet part of her mind remained elsewhere. Something about yesterday refused to settle. She had spent years convincing herself that the past no longer mattered. Yesterday had challenged that belief. After dropping Emily at school, Charlotte boarded the train toward the city. Morning commuters filled the carriage. Some read news reports. Others stared through windows. Nobody paid attention to her. Normally she appreciated that. Today she found herself wondering how many hidden stories surrounded her every morning. How many people had once been someone entirely different. Across the harbor, Blackwood Capital was already awake. Ethan stood in his office reviewing a thin personnel file. The contents frustrated him. 8 months employed as a cleaner. Previous casual positions. Standard references. Nothing unusual, and nothing that explained the woman who had dismantled a multi-million-dollar acquisition model in less than 10 minutes. He closed the file and looked toward Mia. This is incomplete. Mia frowned. It is the full employee record. Then the employee record is wrong. Mia hesitated. You think she concealed something? Ethan turned toward the city skyline. I think she deliberately left something out. An hour later, Charlotte stepped onto the executive floor expecting whispers, curious stares, awkward conversations. Instead, she found silence. Employees passed normally. Assistants carried documents. Analysts hurried between meetings. For a brief moment, she felt relief. Perhaps the entire incident had already been forgotten. Then she noticed 2 junior analysts stop talking the instant she walked past. One nodded politely. The other offered a nervous smile. Charlotte immediately understood. The story had spread. Not publicly, not officially, but enough. Information traveled quickly inside corporate buildings. Especially unusual information. She pushed her cleaning cart toward the conference rooms and focused on work. Glass surfaces, empty bins, meeting spaces, simple tasks, familiar tasks. Yet throughout the morning, she noticed small changes. People greeted her by name. Employees held doors open. Several executives who had previously ignored her entirely suddenly acknowledged her existence. None of them were rude. In some ways that made it stranger. Respect felt unfamiliar when it arrived overnight. Shortly before midday, Charlotte entered a rarely used meeting room on level 36. Sunlight spilled across the polished table. Dust particles floated through the air like tiny stars. She began wiping the glass walls when the door opened behind her. Miss Hayes. Charlotte turned. A man in his 60s stood in the doorway. Silver hair. Impeccable suit. Kind eyes. She recognized him immediately. Graham Mercer. The same director who had laughed in the executive lounge. Good morning, she said carefully. Graham looked uncomfortable. Do you have a moment? Charlotte nodded. Graham stepped inside and closed the door. For several seconds, he seemed unsure how to begin. Finally, he exhaled. I owe you an apology. Charlotte blinked. That was not what she expected. An apology? Graham nodded. Yesterday, I made assumptions. A faint smile crossed Charlotte's face. Most people do. Graham laughed softly. That does not make it acceptable. He looked toward the city beyond the windows. I spent 30 years in finance. Yesterday, a cleaner spotted something I missed. Charlotte could hear the honesty in his voice. It happens. Not often. The response came quickly. Graham studied her for a moment. You know, the strange thing is that after you left, nobody wanted to admit how obvious your point became. Charlotte shook her head gently. It only looks obvious after someone sees it. Graham smiled. That sounds like experience talking. Before Charlotte could answer, his phone vibrated. He glanced at the screen and sighed. Duty calls. He paused near the door. For what it is worth, I am glad you spoke up. Then he left. Charlotte stood alone beside the window. The conversation lasted less than 3 minutes. Yet it affected her more than she expected. Not because Graham apologized. Because his apology confirmed something she had been trying to avoid. People were paying attention now. And attention had consequences. Later that afternoon, several floors above, Ethan received a message from an old contact in Melbourne. The reply was brief. Yet the moment he read it, he sat back slowly in his chair. The message contained only a few lines. A former investment firm, a name, a date, and a sentence that changed everything. Ethan read it twice to make certain. Then a third time. Outside his office window, Sydney Harbor glittered beneath the afternoon sun. Inside, a completely different picture was beginning to emerge. Charlotte Hayes had not merely worked in finance. Years earlier, before she disappeared from the industry, she had been considered one of the brightest investment analysts in the country. Some discoveries arrive like thunder. Others arrive as a single line of text that quietly rearranges everything you thought you knew. Ethan remained alone in his office long after most of the executive floor had emptied for the evening. The city glowed beyond the glass walls. Ferries moved across the harbor like drifting lights. Yet his attention never left the information on his screen. Charlotte Hayes, former senior analyst, award-winning financial strategist, recognized by multiple investment publications before the age of 30. Ethan read through the details slowly. Each fact created a larger question. Why would someone with a career like that disappear completely? The answer did not appear anywhere in the documents. There was no scandal, no professional misconduct, no failed investments. In fact, the opposite seemed true. Every report described Charlotte as exceptionally talented. One article called her one of the most promising analytical minds in Australian finance. Ethan leaned back in his chair. The woman cleaning conference rooms every morning was not merely intelligent. She had once operated at the highest levels of the industry. Then, almost overnight, she had vanished. The following morning, Charlotte arrived at Blackwood Capital determined to restore normality. She kept her head down, focused on work, and avoided unnecessary conversations. The previous 2 days already felt unreal. If she could survive one ordinary shift, perhaps the attention would finally fade. By 8 o'clock, she was cleaning a vacant meeting room on level 28. Sunlight streamed across the table. The scent of fresh coffee drifted through the corridor. Everything felt routine again until her phone rang. Charlotte checked the screen. The school. Her heart skipped. Hello. Good morning, Miss Hayes. Nothing is wrong, the receptionist said kindly. Relief washed through Charlotte so quickly she had to sit down. Emily forgot her excursion permission form. Charlotte closed her eyes. Of course she did. The receptionist laughed softly. It happens. I will bring it during lunch. After the call ended, Charlotte smiled despite herself. Emily inherited many wonderful qualities. Organization was not one of them. That small, ordinary problem grounded her more than any boardroom ever could. Emily was the reason Charlotte had left the world Ethan had discovered. 7 years earlier, after Emily was born and her marriage collapsed under hospital bills, sleepless nights, and promises that did not survive pressure, Charlotte learned how quickly titles could become meaningless. A child needed dinner, school shoes, bedtime stories, and a mother who came home. For the next few hours, she worked peacefully. Then shortly before midday, she received a message asking her to report to the executive floor. Charlotte stared at the screen. Her stomach immediately tightened. She already knew who wanted to see her. 5 minutes later, she stood outside Ethan Blackwood's office. The assistant greeted her warmly. He is expecting you. Charlotte wished those words did not make her nervous. She stepped inside. Ethan stood near the window overlooking the harbor. He turned as she entered. Thank you for coming. You are the chief executive officer, Charlotte replied. I did not have much choice. To her surprise, Ethan smiled. Fair point. Charlotte remained standing. What did you need? Ethan studied her carefully. Yesterday, he had seen a glimpse of her intelligence. Last night, he had discovered a glimpse of her past. Neither matched the person standing before him now. I did some reading. Charlotte felt a chill move through her chest. There it was. The moment she had expected. I assumed you would. You were very successful. That was a long time ago. Not that long. Long enough. Ethan noticed the change in her voice. The distance. The caution. Why did you leave? Charlotte laughed softly. Not because anything was funny, but because the question was familiar. Everyone wanted a clean explanation, as though every broken chapter in life could be filed under one neat heading. Life happened, she said. Ethan remained silent. Waiting. Charlotte shook her head. That answer never satisfies people. No, but it is still true. The room fell quiet. Outside, Sunlight reflected across the water in shifting patterns. Ethan realized something important. Charlotte was not protecting a professional secret. She was protecting a personal wound. The difference mattered. He changed direction. Emily is your daughter? Charlotte looked surprised, then cautious. Yes. How old is she? 7. The answer softened something in her expression immediately. Ethan noticed. Parents always changed when speaking about their children. The tension in Charlotte's shoulders eased for the first time since entering the office. She sounds important. Charlotte almost laughed. More important than anything. Ethan believed her completely. The certainty in her voice left no room for doubt. Suddenly, several missing pieces began fitting together. The career change. The disappearance. The lack of bitterness. Charlotte had not walked away from success because she failed. She walked away because something else mattered more. You know, he said quietly, most people would be angry. About what? Losing a career like that. She looked toward the harbor again. For a long moment she said nothing. Then she smiled. A small smile. Honest. Tired. Real. Some days are harder than others. And the other days? Charlotte thought about Emily's science project. Homework at the kitchen table. Bedtime stories. Small victories. Ordinary moments. The other days remind me what I gained. For the first time since learning the truth about her past, Ethan stopped seeing a former analyst who became a cleaner. Instead, he saw something much rarer. Someone who had sacrificed status without surrendering dignity. Someone who had endured hardship without letting it make her cruel. And for reasons he could not entirely explain, that impressed him far more than anything written in her professional record. The following week should have returned everything to normal. It did not. Charlotte noticed the change first in the smallest details. Invitations appeared in her inbox asking for opinions on reports she had no business reviewing. Analysts greeted her in lifts. Managers who had never learned her name suddenly remembered it. None of it was cruel. In some ways that made it more uncomfortable. Respect arrived carrying expectations, and expectations could be dangerous. Charlotte wanted simplicity. Simplicity did not seem interested in returning. On Thursday afternoon, she was polishing a glass wall on level 30 when Mia approached carrying a tablet. Miss Hayes. Charlotte turned. Yes. Mia offered a polite smile. Mr. Blackwood would like to speak with you. Charlotte almost laughed. Again. Mia's smile widened slightly. Again. 10 minutes later, Charlotte sat across from Ethan in a private meeting room overlooking the harbor. The sky outside glowed a brilliant blue. Ferries crossed the water. Sunlight reflected from neighboring towers. Everything looked calm. The conversation waiting inside the room was not. Ethan placed a folder on the table between them. Charlotte immediately recognized what it contained. Her professional history. Years she preferred to leave behind. You found more information, she said quietly. Ethan nodded. I did. Charlotte looked away. I assumed you would. Ethan remained silent for a moment. Do you know what surprised me most? That I clean offices? No, Charlotte frowned. Ethan leaned forward slightly. That someone with your record accepted being underestimated every day. The words landed unexpectedly. Charlotte stared at the harbor. You make it sound noble. It is not. She smiled faintly. Mostly it is exhausting. Ethan laughed softly. It was the first genuine laugh she had heard from him. Fair answer. The room settled into comfortable silence. Then Ethan opened the folder. I want to offer you something. Charlotte immediately felt her guard rise. No, Ethan blinked. You do not even know what it is. I know enough. Humor me. Charlotte folded her arms. Fine. Ethan slid a document across the table. Senior Strategic Advisor. Charlotte looked down at the title. Then back at him. Absolutely not. Ethan seemed almost amused by how quickly she answered. You have not read the compensation. I do not need to. Most people would. Charlotte shook her head. Most people are not me. Ethan studied her carefully. You would be exceptional in the role. That is not the issue. Then what is? Charlotte looked down at the document. A younger version of herself might have accepted instantly. The salary alone would change everything. Better housing. Better schools. Fewer worries. More security. Every practical argument pointed toward yes. Yet something inside her resisted. I spent years building a different life, she said quietly. You mean a harder life. I mean a life that belongs to me. Ethan considered that. And this does not. Charlotte met his gaze. This feels like going backwards. The answer surprised him. Most people viewed prestigious positions as progress. Charlotte viewed them as a return to something she had deliberately left behind. You loved the work once, Ethan said. Charlotte smiled sadly. I loved many things once. Silence followed. Outside, clouds drifted slowly above the harbor. Ethan realized this conversation was not about employment. It was about identity. Charlotte had spent years rebuilding herself after some unseen loss. Offering her a title was not enough. Titles only mattered if someone wanted the life attached to them. May I ask you something? Ethan said. You usually do. Another brief smile appeared between them. What are you afraid of? Charlotte looked genuinely surprised. Then thoughtful. For a long moment she said nothing. I am not afraid of failing, she said finally. I already survived that. Ethan listened carefully. Then, what? Charlotte glanced toward a framed photo on her phone lying beside her handbag. Emily smiling at a school science fair. I am afraid of becoming someone who misses what matters. The honesty of the answer filled the room. Ethan understood more than she realized. He had spent most of his adult life chasing growth, acquisitions, and success. There were years he barely remembered because work consumed everything. Looking at Charlotte, he suddenly wondered how many important moments he had traded away without noticing. Emily, he said quietly. Charlotte nodded. Emily. Ethan leaned back in his chair. For the first time since meeting her, he stopped trying to convince her. Some decisions were larger than careers, larger than money, larger than status. Very well, he said. Charlotte looked surprised. That is it. That is it. You are giving up easily. Ethan smiled. I did not say I was giving up. Charlotte laughed despite herself. The sound felt unfamiliar after so many difficult years. Genuine. Unforced. Real. Ethan watched her carefully. Not as a former analyst. Not as an employee. Not as a puzzle to solve. Simply as someone whose priorities made sense in a world where many priorities did not. And as Charlotte left the room a few minutes later, neither of them realized that the choice she had just made would soon place her directly in the path of the biggest challenge Blackwood Capital had faced in years. The biggest tests rarely arrive with warning signs. They arrive disguised as ordinary mornings, hidden inside routines that feel completely safe. 3 weeks passed after Charlotte declined Ethan's offer. Life settled into a rhythm again. Emily focused on school. Charlotte focused on work. The attention surrounding her slowly faded into the background. Employees still greeted her more often than before, but the excitement of the discovery had begun to wear off. Charlotte was grateful for that. She wanted peace, not recognition. On a rainy Monday morning, dark clouds hung low over Sydney Harbor. Wind rattled against the glass walls of Blackwood Capital. Charlotte was cleaning a conference room when an unusual tension began spreading through the building. She noticed it first in the pace of people's footsteps. Analysts moved faster. Executives looked distracted. Assistants whispered in corridors. Phones rang constantly. Something was wrong. By mid-morning, the atmosphere had changed completely. Employees gathered in small groups. Meeting rooms filled. The executive floor resembled a hive disturbed without warning. Charlotte pushed her cleaning cart toward the service lift when she heard two analysts talking nearby. The investors are threatening to pull out. If the restructuring fails, we lose months of work. The board meeting starts in 20 minutes. Charlotte kept walking. Corporate crises happened every day. They were not her concern. Yet a familiar feeling returned. The feeling that something important was unfolding nearby. Upstairs, Ethan stood at the head of another boardroom meeting. Unlike the acquisition discussion weeks earlier, this situation was immediate. A major institutional investor had unexpectedly challenged the company's expansion strategy. Market conditions had shifted. Confidence was weakening. Millions of dollars depended on decisions that needed to be made before the end of the day. The board argued. Advisors disagreed. Forecasts conflicted. Hours passed. Progress remained limited. Ethan listened carefully. The room contained some of the brightest financial minds in the country. Yet every proposal seemed trapped inside the same assumptions. The same perspective. The same limitations. Then an unexpected thought crossed his mind. Charlotte. Not because she possessed magical answers. Because she saw problems differently. Ethan immediately dismissed the idea. She had already made her position clear. She did not want a return. She did not want involvement. Yet as the meeting dragged forward, the thought kept returning. Meanwhile, Charlotte spent her lunch break at Emily's school attending a student presentation. Parents sat in small plastic chairs while children proudly explained science projects. Emily stood at the front of the classroom holding a model of the solar system she had built almost entirely from recycled materials. Charlotte watched her daughter speak confidently and felt the familiar warmth that always followed. This was why she made every sacrifice. This was why she refused opportunities that might pull her away. Not because ambition was wrong, because moments like this mattered more. When the presentation ended, Emily ran over smiling. "Did you like it?" Charlotte hugged her tightly. "I loved it, Mom." "Yes." Emily looked thoughtful. "My teacher says some people are really good at helping solve problems." Charlotte smiled. "That is true. You are one of those people." The statement was so simple that it almost hurt. Children had a way of speaking directly to truths adults complicated. Charlotte brushed a loose strand of hair from Emily's face. "Sometimes." Emily nodded as though that settled the matter. Later that afternoon, Charlotte returned to work. Rain tapped softly against the windows. The city beyond looked gray and blurred. She was organizing supplies in a storage room when Mia suddenly appeared at the doorway. Her expression revealed urgency before she spoke. "Charlotte." Charlotte immediately knew something unusual had happened. "What is it?" Mia stepped forward. "Mr. Blackwood needs your help." Charlotte closed her eyes briefly. "Of course he did." "Mia, I know." "No, you have not heard the problem." Charlotte sighed. That has never stopped him before. Despite the tension, Mia smiled. "Please." Charlotte hesitated. Every instinct told her to refuse again. Yet she remembered the analysts, the worried faces, the atmosphere spreading through the building. Something serious was happening. "This is not about a job offer." Mia shook her head. "No. Or a promotion?" "Definitely not." Charlotte looked toward the rain-covered windows. Then back at Mia. 5 minutes. Mia's relief was immediate. "Thank you." As they walked toward the executive floor, Charlotte felt the same uneasy sensation she had experienced weeks earlier. The feeling that life was once again pushing her toward a door she had no intention of opening. Yet sometimes doors opened anyway. And as the lift climbed higher through the tower, neither Charlotte nor Ethan realized that the next conversation would change far more than the future of a single company. The executive boardroom looked very different from the day Charlotte Hayes first entered it. Weeks earlier, she had stood there feeling like an outsider, a cleaner surrounded by executives, a woman everyone underestimated. Today, the atmosphere carried something else entirely. Concern. The rain continued tapping softly against the windows while analysts projected reports across enormous screens. Charts glowed. Forecasts shifted. Numbers changed by the minute. Yet nobody appeared confident. Charlotte entered quietly behind Mia and immediately noticed Ethan standing near the windows. He turned as she arrived. Relief flashed briefly across his face before disappearing beneath his usual composure. "Thank you for coming." Charlotte looked around the room. "What happened?" Ethan gestured toward the screens. "The board is divided. Investors are nervous. We have 3 competing recovery strategies and nobody agrees which one carries the least risk. And you want my opinion." Graham Mercer smiled faintly. "You make it sound unreasonable." "It is unreasonable." Several people laughed softly. The tension eased for a moment. Ethan stepped closer to the display. "Humor us." Charlotte stared at the reports. Familiar feelings returned immediately. Patterns, assumptions, incentives, risks. The language of finance still lived inside her whether she wanted it to or not. She spent several minutes reading quietly. Nobody interrupted. Nobody rushed her. The room understood enough now to wait. Finally, Charlotte looked up. All 3 plans assume confidence returns quickly. Ethan nodded. "That is the expectation." "Then that is the problem." Silence settled across the room. Charlotte pointed toward one of the projections. "You are trying to convince investors not to be afraid." "Yes," Graham said carefully. "Why would that be wrong?" "Because people do not stop being afraid because someone asks them to." The room grew quieter. Confidence is created by proof, not promises. Ethan listened carefully. "Go on." Charlotte pointed toward another chart. "Instead of asking investors to trust projections, show them discipline. Delay the expansion. Protect liquidity. Strengthen fundamentals. Demonstrate patience." One director frowned. "The market may see that as weakness." Charlotte shook her head. "Only insecure leaders think patience looks weak." The statement landed heavily. Ethan found himself smiling despite the seriousness of the situation. She continued. "Right now, everyone expects a dramatic solution." "And?" Ethan asked. The smartest solution is usually the boring one. A few analysts exchanged knowing looks. Charlotte walked slowly toward the harbor-facing windows. Rain streaked across the glass. The city beyond looked distant and gray. People trust companies that survive storms, she said. Not companies that pretend storms do not exist. Nobody spoke. Not because they disagreed. Because they knew she was right. The discussion that followed lasted more than an hour. Questions. Scenarios. Risks. Alternatives. Charlotte answered calmly. Never trying to impress anyone. Never raising her voice. Simply following the logic wherever it led. By the end, something remarkable had happened. The arguments disappeared. The room aligned around a single strategy. Not because Charlotte demanded it, but because clarity often wins when emotion finally steps aside. Ethan looked around the table. Are there any objections? Nobody spoke. For the first time all day, the board agreed unanimously. As executives began gathering their papers, Graham leaned back in his chair and laughed softly. A year ago, if someone told me the most valuable person in this room would be a cleaner, I would have called them insane. Several people smiled. Charlotte shook her head. I am still a cleaner. Graham smiled warmly. That is exactly why you are different. One by one, people left the boardroom. Eventually, only Ethan and Charlotte remained. Rain continued falling beyond the glass walls. The city lights were beginning to appear as evening approached. Ethan stood beside the window. You saved us a great deal of trouble today. You would have figured it out eventually. Maybe, he said. Maybe not. Silence settled comfortably between them. Not awkward. Not uncertain. Simply quiet. Finally, Ethan spoke again. Do you know what I learned from all this? Charlotte smiled faintly. That investment models need better assumptions? That too. He looked directly at her. I learned that I spent years judging people by titles. I assumed success looked a certain way. Then a woman pushing a cleaning cart walked into my company and proved me wrong. Charlotte looked away toward the rain. People are usually more than they appear. Yes, Ethan said. They are. He hesitated, then slid a slim folder across the table. Not the advisor role you rejected, he said. A flexible consulting agreement. 10 hours a month. No late nights unless you choose them. Just your judgment, when it matters. Charlotte stared at the folder. Why? Because Blackwood Capital needs your mind, Ethan said. But Emily needs her mother. I am finally intelligent enough to understand the difference. For a long moment, Charlotte did not speak. This was not a trap dressed as generosity. It was respect. I will read it, she said. Ethan smiled. That is all I can ask. Later that evening, Charlotte rode the train home through the rain-soaked city. She carried no corner office, no new identity, no promise that life would suddenly become easy. But inside her bag was a folder that gave her something she had not allowed herself to want for years. A way to use every part of who she was without losing the part of her life she loved most. When Charlotte opened her front door, Emily ran into her arms exactly as she always did. Mom, you came home before dinner. Charlotte held her daughter tightly and smiled. I told you I would. Nothing about that moment looked impressive. No cameras captured it. No board members applauded. Yet to Charlotte, it was worth more than every title she had ever carried. Across Sydney Harbor, Ethan Blackwood sat alone in his office looking out over the city. He had built a fortune learning how to recognize value. Yet the most important lesson had not come from an acquisition, an investor, or a balance sheet. It came from a woman everyone overlooked. Because sometimes the smartest person in the room is not the person at the head of the table. Sometimes it is the person wiping the table after everyone else leaves. People, like Charlotte, are everywhere. They do not need pity. They need someone to finally notice, listen, and believe them when they speak.